extreme pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Halima Amjad. Dr. Amjad is an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Geriatric Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. In 2015, an essay she wrote about her father's FTD diagnosis won first prize in John A. Hartford Foundation's Better Caregiving, Better Lives Story Contest. Today, she'll draw upon her family's FTD experience as she discusses her vision of a more effective FTD support system. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amjad.
Bring this down just a little bit. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to first thank the AFTD, actually just for having this conference and for inviting me to speak. I, of course, wish I didn't have a story to share, but I am grateful for the opportunity to share my family's journey when really every story and every journey in this room is so important. I also need to just start with a disclaimer that I will try my best not to cry, but I can't make any promises. Now, just to set the stage, my family's FTD, and specifically primary progressive aphasia journey, is still ongoing. My dad is in advanced stages now, but he's still chugging. And I do want to be clear that I'm not his primary caregiver. So my mom, who's here today, is his primary caregiver, and she's really the reason why me, my brother, and sister actually have some semblance of a normal young adult life. My mom really is my dad's brain and voice. And so it always gives me pleasure in some ways to be able to be her voice. But I'm here today because my own voice and my own perspective are unique. And I'm never sure whether this is a blessing or an unfortunate result of circumstances. So I'm both a geriatrician who has a clinical and research focus on dementia. And I also have a less coveted but more difficult to earn degree, or DFTD, or Daughter of Frontotemporal Dementia degree. And if you're wondering which came first, the chicken or the egg, FTD came before my specialization in geriatrics, but my MD and DFTD degrees came around the same time in 2009. Our story, though, really starts in 1949, when my dad was born in a small village in Pakistan. And when I say village, I mean a real village with farmers like my grandfather, mud brick houses, dirt-lined roads, and every family in the village was somehow related to each other. With sibling support, though, my dad went to dental school, got educated, and left the village. And actually, on a bit of a whim with his friends in dental school, they came to the United States. So my dad came to New York City in 1974. And after a couple of years of doing odd jobs, he was able to complete the coursework that he needed to do to be able to work as a dentist in the US. And he ultimately set up a dental practice in Philadelphia in the late 1970s. Now, my parents, as was custom, had an arranged marriage, and I mean a really arranged marriage. They met on their wedding day in 1977, and a couple months after the wedding, my mom came to the US and joined my dad. And actually, the picture that's in the center of the slide was actually taken at the airport when she arrived. And over the next decades, they built love, family, and a life together. And my brother, sister, and I really had an all-American, or at least first-generation American childhood, which of course meant that when I was 4 years old, we moved to the suburbs of Philadelphia, which is the house where my parents still live together today. Now, what was different and really extraordinary in my childhood is the lengths my dad took to support our extended family. So he regularly sent money to his family. I think we had the first village house that had air conditioning. And he sponsored each of his 4 siblings to come to the United States over time. And over time, that meant directly and or indirectly about 30 of my cousins. At one point when I was 6 years old, we had 17 people living in that house. I thought it was fun, but now when I think back, there's no way I could do that for my family. And later on, he actually helped my mom's brother and sister come to the United States, and they're in the pictures on the right. When they came, he was actually more settled, and so my dad actually bought them a duplex in Philadelphia that they could live in. Now, as his daughter, I'm of course extremely biased, but these stories show that when it came to kindness and generosity, my dad was really in a league of his own. My parents, as you can tell, did a lot for others and for their families, and as all of our relatives got settled, we 3 children went to college and then transitioned to graduate school. That was dental school for my brother and sister, who followed in my dad's footsteps, and medical school for me, who frankly was just not that into teeth. This is, of course, when it was time for my parents really to be able to focus their time and their money on themselves. Now, as most of you probably know, this is also where FTD started to enter our lives. And thinking back in the pictures on the left, we think we started to see signs around 2005 when my sister was getting married and my usually very social, very humorous dad was very quiet. My mom chalked it up just to the fact that he was feeling emotional that his firstborn was getting married. And I also remember how nervous he was giving just a few sentences of welcoming remarks to the guests at the wedding. And about a year later, in the pictures on the left, my brother was getting closer to graduating from dental school. And he was extremely excited that my brother would be joining him in the practice, and so he actually wanted to build additional dental practices. He actually bought the building that you can see on the slide, but when they had to make decisions about renovations and how to set up the practice, my mom actually had to make a lot of the decisions, and she found this strange, but we still didn't really make all that much of it. In time, he started complaining that he couldn't remember words. Now, we joked and just said that he was getting older. Of course, thinking back, he was 58. And in geriatrics world, that's a baby. But my dad was actually bothered enough that he actually went to see a neurologist alone. He did okay at the visit, came home, told my mom that he was doing fine, though the neurologist had actually said that he should at least come and follow up in 6 months. My dad never went back to the neurologist alone after that. Over the next 1 to 2 years, my mom noticed personality changes. My dad was more irritable and would snap at her, which was very unlike him, considering I can count on one hand the number of times he raised his voice with me, at least before FTD anyway. As subtle symptoms started to build up, we wondered what was going on. I can actually remember driving the clinical rotations in my 3rd year of medical school and discussing it with my mom on the phone. So we wondered, could it be depression? Is it sleep apnea? My sister was working with my dad and said that she sometimes had to repeat herself to him. So we wondered whether it could be hearing loss and even got him hearing aids. The funny thing is, my dad actually returned the hearing aids because he said they were too expensive. And now thinking back, he actually did the right thing and we were barking up the wrong tree. At some point in all of this, and I honestly can't remember when, the idea of dementia came up. Despite my being in medical school and my uncle being a physician, we didn't know or think much about FTD. I had learned a bit about the behavioral variant in passing in school. I hadn't learned much about primary progressive aphasia. And I remember repeating to my mom a mantra that I had been taught in medical school. If the patient notices the symptoms, it probably isn't dementia. When I speak to medical audiences now, I share that I learned the hard way that that mantra is not always true. My dad did notice it, and it was dementia. When my dad finally went back to the neurologist in late 2008, this time my mom and I went with him. By then he wasn't the only one noticing language problems. And with the time that had passed between the appointments, the diagnosis was now much more clear to the doctor. For me, watching my dad struggle on the mental status testing that I had learned to administer as a medical student was eye-opening and disheartening to say the least. Ultimately, he had additional brain scans and neuropsychologic testing that confirmed a diagnosis we didn't know much about, primary progressive aphasia, and the MRIs on the slides are actually my dad's, and they showed shrinkage in certain parts of the brain more than others. In the days and weeks that followed the diagnosis, though the doctor actually never said the words openly to my dad, he knew what was happening. At an appointment where he was asked to name the names of the presidents backwards, when he got stuck on Ronald Reagan, he said, "The president who has what I have." And once in my bedroom, he saw the book, What If It's Not Alzheimer's, on my dresser, and asked if he was supposed to read the book. At that time, the frustration when he was trying to speak or express himself was clear as well. And I'll be honest, we didn't really discuss the diagnosis or what was happening with my dad, and I still am not sure whether that was the right thing to do, because we do know that he knew what was happening and that he had dementia. Around that time, early on in the diagnosis, my mom and I also went to a conference similar to this one. And I remember just having a huge lump in my throat, just seeing all the other faces that were at the conference, the other children, the other spouses that were there. And I remember that my mom did cry when one speaker was acting out what a person with FTD looks like or acts like, because it was exactly my dad. And just after my dad was diagnosed, within a couple of months, I graduated from medical school, and there's the two bottom pictures on the slide are from my graduation. And I vividly remember after the graduation ceremony when my dad told me he was proud of me. Now, I'm sure he said this to me at my prior graduations as well, but I remember this time very clearly because of how fluently and easily the words came to him at a time when language was clearly getting harder. And of course, in the years that followed, we had other challenges we faced. So we had to ease my dad out of driving. He had a couple of minor accidents, so we knew he shouldn't drive anymore. Even though he wasn't driving by then, my mom, I know, will never forget the day they had to physically go and turn in his license. Ironically though, my dad actually stopped driving before he stopped working. We did slowly cut his work back, and the work he was doing was much more simplified. He was doing basic cleanings rather than procedures or fillings. And my brother and sister worked with him, so they were able to check over his work. In some ways, I think he was also able to keep working because his assistants, who'd been working with him for so long, knew what instrument he wanted, even when he said the wrong word or couldn't say what he wanted them to hand him, or wanted them to hand him. But we knew, of course, that he couldn't keep working, even if he could do the manual labor. Well, it's easy to talk about these issues now. At the time, it was months and months of discussion trying to figure out really how we would impose these changes on him. Work was all he ever knew, really, as he was providing for his family, and so it was certainly tough to figure out how we would put this big change in his life. Now, as a physician, I'm sometimes the person telling patients that they can't drive or they shouldn't be working. Sometimes, of course, it has to be said, but I do always keep my experiences with me and try to approach each patient delicately and recognize that what needs to be done doesn't always match the reality and the difficulties that patients and their families face. Now, of course, during all of this, there were times that were good but bittersweet. My brother and I both got married. The 4 pictures on the left are of my wedding. And while at my wedding, my dad couldn't give a short speech or welcoming remarks like he did at my sister's wedding. He stood next to my brother, who spoke on his behalf. And though by then he couldn't express himself with words, my dad cried at my wedding. And that let me know how he felt when his words couldn't. My sister also had a baby, my parents' first grandchild. Now there's more. And to this day, my dad knows all his grandchildren, even if he can't say their names. But it's tough for us knowing the grandfather he would have been. His humor, kindness, and generosity, and love of ice cream would have multiplied 1,000 times over. And it has been sad but interesting, actually, to see how each of the grandkids reacts to him. So my oldest niece is a little bit wary of him right now, but her 4-year-old sister, on the other hand, really takes to keeping an eye on my dad. She'll physically block him from leaving the house. And she notices, actually, when there's changes. So when he started talking less, she actually asked why he wasn't talking. And when she lost her voice because she had a cold, she commented that both she and her grandfather couldn't talk because they were sick. My niece on the far right loves to feed my dad and tries to march into the bathroom with his diaper when we're cleaning him. And recently, we found and bought all of my nieces and nephews this book, How to Babysit a Grandpa, even though I honestly think they could have written the book, even though they're anywhere from age 3 to 6. Now, the hardest part of the disease was when my dad started to develop behavioral problems. He was never violent, but he would push us away, including when he was anxious, even during family pictures. I think he may have thought we were attacking his face, so he pushed us away, and we got a great picture out of it when we all laughed after he pushed us away. But when he was getting more agitated and anxious, incontinence understandably made him more anxious, and this of course made it harder for us sometimes to clean him up. He was also lightning fast when he started eating anything and everything, raw meat, inedible objects included. So I literally had a cookie I was eating snatched out of my hand when I turned my head for a second, but I honestly couldn't blame him on that one. And pacing and wandering for us actually remain difficult problems. He's gotten out of the house and down the street a few times. Luckily, we've found him each time because he always takes the same route. But we do now have key locks actually on the inside of all of our doors in the house and a GPS tracker watch. I do joke, though, that if I'm ever in a building that's on fire, I'm going to follow my dad because he will find the exit quicker than anybody else. And for a time, though he was down actually just to a couple of phrases, he would yell these phrases at any strangers that he saw. And he loved to go out, but this of course made it harder to take him out. We were a bit lucky that the phrases he was yelling was in a foreign language, but still, we would get strange looks from people. Ironically though, with progression of disease and actually loss of language, it's actually easier for us now to take him out. Now, as a family, we've learned a lot over the years, and I do think that we've done a pretty good job given the circumstances. We cry sometimes, but we also laugh a lot. My mom's always good about sending us pictures of any weird antics or funny things my dad has done. We also argue, but we also come together to help. All the credit really goes to my mom's love and dedication. And honestly, for us children, facing dementia early has also meant that we have a parent who's healthy enough to care for the other person. And my dad's immigration, his work, and his emphasis on us children getting educated has also meant that financially we've been able to pay for help. And my mom can focus on taking care of my dad without financial stress. There's unfortunately no denying that in the current system, money does make the journey a bit easier. Now, when I first shared my family's story, I talked about my dad and mom returning to the village that he had left after being raised there as a child. Now, my mom is extremely strong, but I don't think she could survive without the support network around her. So my brother lives just a couple of minutes away, and my aunt and uncle, who are actually here today, also live just a couple of minutes away. I'll admit we did get a bit lucky that it's my dad's brother who's married to my mom's sister. So in some ways we have two sets of parents and extra help. But they're all close by, and we've learned that they can get there quickly anytime that's necessary. And we eventually hired companions to come a few times a week to spend time with my dad. We weren't sure actually how he would react to that, but he's loved making new friends and having people who will take him out of the house. On this slide, I have a picture of Linda, who's really like family now. When they notice changes, she and my mom will sit and cry together. And I think she's actually with my dad right now, so she's the reason my mom was able to come and join us at the conference. And our extended family, who my dad once supported, also help out. Some watch my dad, some can even take him to the bathroom, others help my mom with yard work. Our neighbor actually sends his son to clean the driveway when it snows, and he sees that none of our cars are on the driveway. And because it can be hard to go out, some relatives simply just host a familiar home where my parents can go for a change of scenery and some company. That's not to say that we don't have some family members who call with suggestions of herbal supplements and prayers that he's going to get better. They're part of the village, but they're a little bit more on the outskirts. But overall, we certainly have relatives and family that have pulled together to help us deal with this disease. And beyond family and paid help, I also made my mom a Facebook account just so that she could join some of the FTD support groups online that many of you are a part of. And she and I have both taken a lot of strength from knowing that there's a bigger FTD community out there and other people struggling like we are. And honestly, we've gained a lot of caregiving tips, and certainly more caregiving tips on Facebook than we have from even the medical community that we've interacted with. More recently, we've wondered if disease progression has actually made things easier in some ways, but I actually think that we in our village have adapted and simply learned how to handle challenges better. We have cleaning my dad and changing his diaper down to a science, even when we're out. There's always new challenges, of course. My dad had a dental infection just about a month ago, and we managed to get the tooth extracted somehow, and he looks a lot better. And ironically, the story that I wrote for the John Hartford Foundation Caregiving Story Contest, I actually wrote it at night while I was staying at my aunt and uncle's house, helping take care of my dad while my mom recovered from knee replacement. So there's always new challenges, but I think at this point, with the network and the village around us, there's not much that we can't handle. Now, though we face FTD as a family, and no doubt the primary caregiver has it the worst, being a child of a parent with FTD isn't easy either. When I see parents and grandparents who are healthy or honestly have any non-dementia disease, I'm jealous. I still have a dad, but he's not the dad who raised me, who used to buy me ice cream, or who used to laugh before he got to the punchline of a joke or story that he was sharing. One thing that's always hard for me to talk about is that he isn't the dad who used to say that I should be a professor at a medical school. That dad had advanced dementia by the time I finished training and took a faculty position at Johns Hopkins last summer. I have come to love the dad I have now, to miss him when I haven't seen him in a while, to enjoy just sitting with him and holding hands, or taking him for a drive because the car is his favorite place. But I would of course trade for my old dad in a heartbeat if I could. Now, someone once asked me if I had ever changed a baby's diaper. I responded by asking whether they had ever changed an adult diaper. And I'm not sure how many young adults can or want to say that. Now, for many of us children, FTD comes at a time when we're still trying to build our own lives, our own careers, and our own families. Some children have it harder and they're still children when it comes. For all of us, though, FTD changes the course of our lives permanently, whether we realize it or not. And I know for many of us, trying to balance all of this doesn't always work well. We also face a fear that spouses don't. I think many of us children have that moment when we learn that FTD can be hereditary. So even when there isn't a clear family history, the fear is real and always present. Every time I can't think of a word, I panic. Now, there is some good, I will say, in that fear. My dad didn't have disability insurance, and I do. And my husband and I have had conversations and discussions that some people never have, and definitely don't have in their 20s and 30s, about what care we would want if we developed dementia. And honestly, living with my dad's FTD has also simply taught us to appreciate what he gave us when he still could, what we do still have, the memories we still all make together, and of course the people and the village that are helping us on this journey. Like all FTD members, though, FTD has seeped into every part of my life, not just my family. So in terms of my career, I tell myself that I chose geriatrics because I enjoy working with older patients and the general approach of geriatrics, which is that often less is more. But I think my experience with my dad helped me appreciate the patient population and that approach to medicine. And his disease has definitely led to my clinical and research focus on dementia within the field of geriatrics. I basically try to take advantage of an unwanted situation. So I've given talks to medical audiences and my peers about my dad, frontotemporal dementia, and challenging care decisions that we've had to make. I shared my story, of course, with the Hartford Foundation, and on the slide I have the opening PowerPoint of medical grand rounds I gave at Yale, where I talked about early onset dementia. And when my dad had a seizure about a year ago, I shared his case just to walk my colleagues through how we decided what to do about it. In my research, which focuses on improving care for people with dementia, I also try to think about challenges that we've faced. So I've done some early studies on safety issues in dementia, such as driving, and the importance of having a doctor who knows you. And I'm now doing work to try to link earlier diagnosis with better patient outcomes and think about strategies to help prevent hospitalization for people with dementia. Now, I've learned a lot, both as a physician and as a child of FTD. I'm going to share some of these things that I've learned with you, but I think a lot of it is things that a lot of caregivers already know, and I'll simply vouch for it as someone coming from the medical side as well. First, diagnosis isn't always easy, even when you suspect dementia. Thinking back, it wasn't crazy to entertain other diagnoses early on. As frustrated as we were, I still sometimes have to tell patients and families that time will help make a dementia diagnosis clear. And I never just write off their concerns. But I will say that if I had a penny for every time people come in with having been evaluated for depression, sleep apnea, and hearing aids, I would probably be one of the richest geriatricians in the United States. I'm also a bit wary of the patients that come in alone, even if they've noticed their symptoms. So if a patient comes in alone, I always try to reach out to a family member to find out if they have any concerns and share my recommendations. I also believe that early diagnosis can make a difference, and I think most people here probably agree, but to be honest, in the medical community, it's actually a controversy about whether we should diagnose dementia early because there isn't effective treatment. In my dad's case, I don't think that opening one additional dental practice would have changed. But before we got to the diagnosis, a friend convinced my dad to buy another dental practice. So he went from one practice to 3 practices at a time that his days working were actually numbered. So for us, there are definitely things we would have done differently had we known what was coming. Also come to appreciate, both in my role as a physician and as a patient, that time and listening are important treatments. And when there isn't a cure, a supportive ear can still go a long way. And I've also appreciated that it's easy to tell people what to do. For example, I'll often tell caregivers that you shouldn't snap at your loved one, they don't know what they're doing. But I sometimes snap at my dad when he's walking too slow or I'm getting impatient with him. So it's easy to tell people what to do, but at the same time I always try to acknowledge that it's not easy. The next pieces I've learned is that doctors don't always know best. Caregivers, and I'll say patients here too, are important advocates and teachers, and we all have a role to play in spreading knowledge. As a geriatrician, I was really proud of my mom about a year and a half ago when my dad did have that seizure. After blood work and a CAT scan of the brain were done and came back normal, even before talking to me, my mom refused the recommended MRI and staying in the hospital longer for an EEG because she knew that these tests wouldn't change management at all and they would just be difficult for my dad to go through. And when we told Dr. Anike that the medication that had been started for his seizure actually got rid of the muscle jerking that he had been having, even the doctor who specializes in FTD said he had learned something new. And I will say the reason I added that patients are also important advocates and teachers, because I've seen firsthand on the Facebook groups that when someone has a concern or an issue that they mention and I'm about to respond to it, I see that Cheryl Whitman has already said what I would have said. So patients may also know. Lastly, as we watched my dad first revert to his childhood language, then to a stage where he would sing instead of speak, to now, where he still actually understands more than we realize, we sometimes just take a step back and appreciate how. I personally don't know if I would be where I am today and doing what I'm doing if it weren't for FTD. And as sad as I feel knowing that my dad can't fully appreciate that I've accomplished the dream that he had for me, I also got here because of him, and I'm a better physician because of both my old dad and my new dad. Now, a lot of us, I know, say it is what it is, and that's true. When I said that to the chair of medicine at Johns Hopkins last year, he reminded me that through my work, I am doing something about it. Not all of us are working in a lab to find a cure. Not all of us are in healthcare. But every story, every volunteer, everyone who simply reaches out to another person online is doing something. And by all of us contributing our something, we're building a wider village, a city like Baltimore or Philadelphia, where we can move treatment and care for FTD forward. Now, for those of you who are living with FTD, I hope that we can learn from you and over time do better by you. For my fellow children of FTD, we learned at lunch that we're not alone. And for those of you who are or were a primary caregiver, I simply want to say thank you. And finally, thank you to the AFTD for your work in building the blueprints and the roadmaps for our city. Thank you.